A man in Havana lights a cigar, unaware it could be his last. The smooth smoke curls into the night air, but this cigar carries a secret, one laced with poison. Elsewhere, a diver swims towards the Caribbean reef, drawn to a giant seashell planted on the ocean floor. Inside the shell waits not a pearl, but high explosives. These were not scenes from a spy novel. They were real plots, conceived, funded, and approved by the highest levels of the United States government. The target was Fidel Castro, the revolutionary who had defied Washington and embraced Moscow. The weapon was Operation Mongoose, a covert campaign of sabotage and assassination unlike anything America had ever attempted in the Cold War. What was at stake was not just one man's life, but the balance of the entire world. And as declassified files reveal, the line between dark comedy and nuclear catastrophe was far thinner than anyone dared admit. The year was 1961. The Bay of Pigs invasion had ended in disaster, leaving the Kennedy administration humiliated and desperate for a way to strike back at Cuba. Fidel Castro, once a scrappy guerrilla commander, now stood defiant at America's doorstep, backed by Soviet money, Soviet weapons, and soon, Soviet missiles. To Washington, he wasn't just a problem. He was a symbol of defiance, a living reminder that the United States could be challenged in its own hemisphere. In the shadows, the Central Intelligence Agency was handed a mission. It would not be fought on battlefields or announced in Congress. It would be waged in silence under the codename Operation Mongoose. The plan: destabilize Cuba, break Castro's hold on power, and, if the opportunity arose, remove him permanently. What followed was one of the strangest and most reckless covert operations of the entire Cold War. For decades, the details were hidden, dismissed as rumor or conspiracy theory. But when the files were finally declassified, they revealed a chilling truth. This was not a handful of rogue agents going too far. This was official policy, approved by the president, coordinated at the highest levels of government, and executed with almost surreal imagination. In the next hour, you'll uncover how Operation Mongoose was born, how its wild assassination plots unfolded, and why the world never knew the full scope of its danger until decades later. Because behind the poisoned cigars and exploding seashells lay something far more serious: a covert war that nearly pushed the United States and the Soviet Union into direct confrontation. And before we dive in, I'd love to know from you, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now as you listen? Drop it in the comments. I always enjoy seeing the global community that gathers here. Now, let's begin. In the early 1960s, the world was perched on the knife's edge of history. The Cold War was not merely a contest of ideology, it was a global duel in which a misstep could erase millions of lives in seconds. The United States and the Soviet Union were not only building weapons, but also building narratives. Each side painted itself as the champion of human destiny, while behind closed doors, fear dictated every decision. For Washington, Cuba had become a nightmare. The revolution of 1959 had shocked policymakers. Fidel Castro, with his scruffy beard, fiery speeches, and almost mythic presence, had toppled the Batista dictatorship, a regime that had long been supported, directly or indirectly, by American business interests. Overnight, the island that had been a playground for U.S. corporations, bankers, and even mobsters became a fortress of revolution 90 miles from Florida's shore. Castro did not merely seize power, he nationalized American-owned sugar fields, oil refineries, and hotels. He drove out the mafia families who had made Havana their casino capital, and he made it clear he would not bow to Washington. His message was simple and infuriating: Cuba would no longer be America's colony. The reaction in the United States was disbelief, then rage. The Eisenhower administration had already begun covert operations to isolate and weaken Castro, but when John F. Kennedy entered the White House in January 1961, the situation took on a new urgency. Kennedy, young, charismatic, and ambitious, had campaigned on closing the so-called missile gap with the Soviets. But now, as he settled into office, he faced a humiliating reality: a defiant communist state just across the water, daring him to act. The CIA had a ready-made solution: an invasion. Using Cuban exiles trained in Guatemala, the agency devised a plan to land on Cuba's shores, spark a popular uprising, and topple Castro. Kennedy, still inexperienced in the ways of covert war, approved it. What followed was the Bay of Pigs. The invasion, launched in April 1961, was a catastrophe. Poorly planned, undersupported, and riddled with wishful thinking, the operation ended with Castro's forces crushing the exiles in less than 3 days. Kennedy was humiliated on the world stage. America had not only failed to overthrow Castro, but had revealed its hand in spectacular fashion. Khrushchev, watching from Moscow, saw the young president stumble. Castro emerged stronger than ever, a revolutionary David who had slain his imperial Goliath. Inside the Kennedy administration, the mood turned bitter. Some advisors blamed the CIA for misleading the president about the invasion's chances. Others blamed Kennedy for hesitating, refusing to provide direct U.S. military support when the exiles were cornered. But beneath the recriminations was a consensus: Castro had to go. It was Robert F. Kennedy, the Attorney General and the president's most trusted confidant, who articulated this view with blunt force. The top priority of the United States government, he declared in meetings, is the removal of Fidel Castro. The words carried more than ambition. They carried obsession. What few Americans realized at the time was how seriously those words were taken. To the CIA, they amounted to a green light. If the White House demanded Castro's removal, then the agency would provide it, whatever the method, whatever the cost. To understand what came next, it is important to grasp the atmosphere inside the CIA. The agency, born in the ashes of World War II, had been shaped by men who believed in the ruthless power of covert action. Many were veterans of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which had parachuted agents behind Nazi lines and carried out sabotage across Europe and Asia. To them, the Cold War was simply an extension of that struggle. Assassinations, coups, psychological warfare. These were not aberrations. They were tools, sharpened and ready. Throughout the 1950s, the CIA had tested these tools with startling success. In 1953, it engineered the overthrow of Iran's Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, restoring the Shah to power. In 1954, it toppled Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, safeguarding American corporate interests in bananas and sugar. Both operations were executed with a mix of propaganda, bribes, and covert force. To the agency, they were triumphs, proof that a small, secret team could shape nations from the shadows. But Cuba was different. Here was a charismatic leader with broad popular support, rooted in nationalist pride and backed increasingly by the Soviet Union. Toppling him would require more than leaflets and bribed officers. It would require something audacious, something more akin to a covert war. This was the world before Operation Mongoose, a landscape of Cold War paranoia, Kennedy's bruised ego, and a CIA emboldened by past victories, but facing an adversary unlike any it had encountered. The island of Cuba was not just a military problem, it was a psychological wound. Every day Castro remained in power, he reminded Washington and the world that American might was not absolute. On the streets of Havana, the mood was electrified. Billboards declared "Patria o muerte," fatherland or death. Young men and women joined the committees for the defense of the revolution, neighborhood watch groups that blended patriotism with surveillance. Rumors swirled of American plots. Every Cuban was told to remain vigilant, to guard against sabotage, to suspect the stranger who asked too many questions. Meanwhile, in Miami, a different mood took hold. Cuban exiles, many of them wealthy families stripped of their fortunes by Castro's nationalizations, nursed their grievances and dreams of return. They joined training camps, formed exile groups, and whispered of liberation. The CIA saw in them a ready army, a resource to be exploited again and again. The Soviet Union, for its part, was watching carefully. Khrushchev admired Castro's defiance. To him, Cuba was more than an ally. It was proof that socialism could spread into the Americas, right under the nose of the United States. Every attempt by Washington to crush Castro only deepened Havana's bond with Moscow. It was this triangle, Washington, Havana, Moscow, that would define the early 1960s. At its center was a small island, but in its shadow loomed the possibility of nuclear confrontation. Kennedy and Khrushchev both knew that if the Cold War ever turned hot, Cuba could be the spark. Yet, even as these high-level calculations unfolded, inside the walls of the CIA, a different conversation was taking place. It was not about ideology or geopolitics. It was about logistics. How could one man, Fidel Castro, be removed from the stage? Assassination had been whispered before, but now it became a matter of policy. Officials debated methods with a mixture of seriousness and absurdity. Could his beard be poisoned so it would fall out, undermining his iconic image? Could his speeches be sabotaged so his voice would crack? Could an exploding seashell, planted in his favorite diving spots, lure him to his death? The fact that these ideas were entertained not in the margins, but in official channels, tells us much about the desperation of the moment. In 1961, as Operation Mongoose began to take shape, Kennedy turned to one man to oversee it, General Edward Lansdale. Lansdale was no ordinary officer. He was a legend in the world of covert warfare, credited with engineering counterinsurgency victories in the Philippines. He believed in psychological operations, in breaking an enemy's spirit as much as his beatings would. To Lansdale, Castro was not just a leader, but a symbol that had to be shattered. The appointment of Lansdale marked a turning point. The campaign against Cuba would no longer be ad hoc. It would be systematic, coordinated across the government, with resources funneled into sabotage, propaganda, and assassination attempts. Operation Mongoose was born not as a sideshow, but as a central pillar of U.S. policy. But before the first plan was drafted, before the first agent was dispatched, the seeds had already been planted in a moment of failure, the Bay of Pigs. That defeat burned in Kennedy's memory, haunting his every move. He could not allow it to stand. He would not be the president who allowed a communist stronghold to thrive at America's doorstep. And in that determination lay the origins of a covert war that would blur the line between absurdity and apocalypse. What Kennedy did not yet realize was that the effort to destroy Castro would soon entangle not only the CIA and the White House, but also the mafia, foreign mercenaries, and the very balance of nuclear power. The world before Operation Mongoose was already dangerous, but the world after it would teeter on the edge of disaster. Operation Mongoose was born in silence, in the rooms where men in suits and uniforms spoke quietly about actions they could never admit in public. By late 1961, Kennedy's resolve had hardened, and Robert F. Kennedy's words still echoed through the corridors of power. The removal of Castro was to be the government's top priority. To the CIA, this directive carried the force of a presidential order. And so, a machine was set into motion, one that would combine cold calculation with a kind of surreal creativity. At the center of it all was General Edward Lansdale. His mandate was broad and uncompromising. Mongoose would not simply attempt another invasion, it would attack Cuba from every angle. Political, economic, psychological, and physical. Every weakness would be exploited. Kennedy wanted results, and Lansdale promised them. The White House demanded progress reports every 30 days, and Lansdale delivered them with a mix of optimism and menace. Each report listed sabotage missions completed, agents recruited, propaganda spread, and new assassination concepts under review. What emerged from these files is a portrait of a campaign that oscillated between deadly seriousness and almost cartoonish absurdity. On paper, it was an organized covert operation. In reality, it was a collection of schemes that seemed drawn from the imagination of a pulp novelist, yet each carried the weight of official sanction. Among the first plots considered was one of psychological warfare. Castro, after all, was not just a politician. He was a symbol, and his beard had become iconic. CIA chemists were instructed to devise a depilatory agent, something that could be slipped into his shoes or onto his clothing. The hope was that his thick black beard would fall out, stripping him of the rugged image that made him a revolutionary hero. As one declassified document later revealed, his physical appearance was an instrument of power. To alter it would be to weaken his hold on the people. Then came the cigars. Everyone knew Castro loved them. The CIA explored several variations. Some were poisoned, others laced with hallucinogens. The idea was not merely to kill him, but perhaps to make him act erratically in public, undermining his credibility. Imagine, the planners whispered, Castro giving a fiery speech only to begin rambling incoherently, his reputation collapsing before his own supporters. The documents read like dark comedy, yet the intent behind them was lethal. The obsession with his personal habits extended into his passion for diving. Castro was known to escape the pressures of leadership by exploring the reefs of Cuba's coast. The CIA saw opportunity. One plan involved contaminating his diving suit with a fungus that would cause a debilitating skin disease. Another envisioned placing an exotic seashell, painted in bright, alluring colors, at one of his favorite diving spots. Inside the shell, a small explosive would be hidden, ready to detonate when lifted. It was a plan as fantastical as it was chilling. Not every plot relied on exotic gadgets. Some were blunt, rooted in old-fashioned assassination. The CIA made contact with figures in the American mafia, men with long histories in Havana's casinos and nightclubs before Castro drove them out. Figures like Sam Giancana and Santo Trafficante had lost fortunes when the revolution closed their establishments. They were eager for revenge, and the CIA saw them as tools. Poisons were passed through intermediaries, vials designed to be slipped into Castro's food or drink. Meetings took place in shadowy corners of Miami hotels, where mobsters and intelligence officers mingled over whiskey, each using the other for their own ends. These efforts did not occur in a vacuum. They unfolded against the background of a world moving closer to confrontation. In 1962, Cuba formally deepened its ties to the Soviet Union. Shipments of weapons arrived, and Soviet advisors walked the streets of Havana. The United States responded with increased surveillance, flights of U-2 reconnaissance planes streaking across Cuban skies, cameras clicking, gathering images of bases and facilities that suggested something far more dangerous might be underway. But inside the Kennedy administration, the pressure for immediate action against Castro never abated. Robert Kennedy pressed Lansdale again and again, demanding progress. He wanted sabotage. He wanted proof that the campaign was working. Farms were burned, sugar shipments destroyed, factories disrupted. Yet Castro remained unbroken, his speeches as defiant as ever. Each act of sabotage hardened Cuban resolve, and each failed assassination attempt deepened his aura of invincibility. Among those involved, frustration mingled with dark creativity. Richard Helms, who would later become director of Central Intelligence, recalled in testimony that the range of ideas put forward was unlike anything else in the agency's history. It was as though we were brainstorming in a room with no limits, he admitted, and the president wanted results. Yet, results were elusive. Time after time, plots fell apart through the bad luck, poor planning, or the simple fact that Castro was not an easy man to kill. The cigars never reached him. The poison pills meant to be delivered by mafia contacts were misplaced. The diving suit never left the laboratory. Each failure was noted, reported, and followed by a new plan. What makes Operation Mongoose so disturbing is not only the creativity of its methods, but also the seriousness with which they were pursued. These were not rogue fantasies. They were briefed to the highest levels of government, including the president himself. In the declassified documents, Kennedy's impatience is palpable. He wanted to see Castro gone before the midterm elections of 1962. He saw the Cuban leader not only as a threat to hemispheric stability, but as a personal political liability. And so the machine kept turning, each month producing new schemes, new missions, new risks. Meanwhile, in Havana, Castro was well aware that he was the target of assassination attempts. He later joked that if surviving them were an Olympic sport, he would hold the gold medal. Yet, behind the humor lay vigilance. His security forces remained on constant alert. Meals were carefully prepared, bodyguards rotated, his movements kept unpredictable. The committees for the defense of the revolution spread rumors of infiltrators, spies, and saboteurs. Every unexplained accident was suspected to be an American plot, and sometimes it was. The Cuban people lived in an atmosphere of constant tension. Factories were sabotaged, fields set aflame, bombs planted in theaters and shops. To Washington, these were small acts designed to destabilize. To Cubans, they were reminders that their nation was under siege. Each incident reinforced Castro's warnings that the empire to the north sought their destruction. The irony of Operation Mongoose was that it often achieved the opposite of its intent. Rather than weaken Castro, it strengthened his position. Each failed attempt fed the mythology of his survival. Each act of sabotage unified the Cuban people around him. The more the CIA tried to break him, the more indestructible he seemed. But inside the United States government, this irony was not appreciated. What mattered was not perception, but momentum. Robert Kennedy continued to demand results. Lansdale's reports grew darker, filled with promises of new operations just over the horizon. The CIA, desperate to appease the White House, continued to expand its imagination. In one of the most bizarre proposals, scientists suggested dusting the broadcast studio where Castro gave his long speeches with a hallucinogenic substance. The hope was that he would lose his composure live on air, rambling incoherently, revealing himself as unstable. Another plan suggested contaminating his clothing with chemicals that would cause disorientation. Each idea was logged, reviewed, and sometimes pursued to the edge of feasibility before collapsing under the weight of its own absurdity. Yet, while the world may laugh at these plots today, the consequences of Mongoose were anything but comedic. The constant campaign of sabotage, the open partnership with mafia figures, the near obsession with assassination, all of it pushed the United States and Cuba into a spiral of hostility that could not remain confined to the shadows. The Soviet Union, watching from afar, began to see Cuba not only as an ally, but as a frontline state in the Cold War. If America was determined to strangle the revolution, Moscow would have to provide protection. By mid-1962, the stage was set for the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War. Operation Mongoose had failed to topple Castro, but it had succeeded in convincing him that only nuclear protection could ensure Cuba's survival. And so, while CIA officers continued to brainstorm poisoned cigars and exploding seashells, Soviet ships carried missiles across the Atlantic, their cargo hidden beneath tarps and camouflage. The men who had ordered Operation Mongoose did not yet realize it, but their campaign of sabotage and assassination was about to collide with a far greater danger. The obsession with killing one man was driving the world toward a nuclear standoff. The question was no longer whether Castro could be removed. It was whether the world itself could survive the escalation that Operation Mongoose had helped ignite. October 1962. The world is edging toward midnight. Reconnaissance flights over Cuba reveal what Washington had long feared but dared not say aloud: Soviet nuclear missiles stationed just 90 miles from American shores. Photographs show launch pads under construction, warheads that could reach Washington, New York, or Chicago in minutes. The Cold War suddenly has a countdown clock, and it is ticking fast. In the Oval Office, President John F. Kennedy gathers his advisors for tense deliberations. They call it the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOM. Around the table sit the most powerful men in America: Robert Kennedy, Dean Rusk, McGeorge Bundy, Robert McNamara. They debate airstrikes, invasion, blockade, but always in the shadows lingers another question: what about Castro himself? For even in this moment of potential nuclear annihilation, Operation Mongoose is still running. Plots are still moving forward, assassins still being prepared, sabotage still authorized. The CIA's Task Force W, under Edward Lansdale, had not stood down. Instead, it intensified its efforts. Agents had been instructed to recruit contacts inside Cuba who could carry out bombings of factories, power plants, and even shipping docks. There were proposals to burn sugarcane fields, to poison crops, to unleash plagues that would weaken the island's economy and morale. And while Soviet missiles were being placed on Cuban soil, the CIA was simultaneously pushing forward assassination schemes, as if Castro's death might magically dismantle the nuclear threat. But this is where Operation Mongoose and the Missile Crisis collided in the most dangerous way imaginable. To Moscow, any U.S. attempt to topple Castro by force would be seen as an attack on their ally, and possibly as preparation for a strike against the Soviet Union itself. Nikita Khrushchev had made it clear, Cuba's survival was a red line. The missiles were both a deterrent and a statement, harm Castro and risk nuclear war. Yet in Washington, the obsession with eliminating Castro remained so strong that some within the CIA believed killing him during the crisis would decapitate the threat and force the Soviets to retreat. Files declassified years later reveal just how dangerously close these two tracks came to collision. In late October 1962, while U.S. Navy ships formed a blockade around Cuba, a CIA operation was preparing to deliver poison pills to contacts who could slip them into Castro's food. Another scheme considered placing explosives in Cuban industrial facilities to create chaos. To the outside world, Kennedy appeared calm, measured, willing to negotiate with Khrushchev. But behind closed doors, the United States was still conducting a covert war against Cuba, even as the nuclear clock ticked louder. The tension became unbearable. On October 27th, known now as Black Saturday, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, killing its pilot. Another U-2, on the same day, accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace over Siberia, nearly triggering a military response. The same day, Soviet submarines near the blockade line considered launching nuclear torpedoes after being depth-charged by U.S. ships. At that moment, one nervous order, one misread signal, could have set off a global cataclysm. And yet, simultaneously, CIA officers were still pushing their assassination plots forward. Historians now argue this represented the single most reckless convergence of covert action and nuclear brinkmanship in U.S. history. The assassination of Castro, if attempted or successful during the missile crisis, would almost certainly have provoked Soviet retaliation. Khrushchev had stationed not just strategic missiles in Cuba, but also tactical nuclear weapons, short-range warheads intended to be used if U.S. troops invaded. And U.S. intelligence at the time did not even know they existed. An American landing on Cuban beaches, or the sudden death of Castro, could have triggered their deployment, setting off a chain reaction spiraling far beyond Washington's control. President Kennedy knew the stakes. Though he had authorized Mongoose, he began to see its danger in a new light. He privately told his brother Robert that the CIA's obsession with Castro had become a liability, that in the middle of nuclear negotiations, it risked undermining every careful step toward de-escalation. And indeed, as messages from Khrushchev arrived, one conciliatory, one threatening, the president chose to respond to the softer one, hoping to steer the crisis toward resolution. The deal, as the world would later learn, was fragile. Publicly, the Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island. Secretly, Kennedy also agreed to remove Jupiter missiles from Turkey, though that part would remain classified for years. The world stepped back from the abyss, but in the shadows, the CIA remained frustrated. To them, Castro had survived yet again, shielded by the very crisis that had brought humanity closest to annihilation. Declassified documents revealed the bitterness. Some CIA officials wrote afterward that if they had been allowed to finish the job, Castro would not have lasted. They believed his death during the missile crisis would have solved the problem permanently. But to historians, the reality is more chilling. Had Operation Mongoose succeeded in eliminating Castro in October 1962, the likely outcome would not have been peace, but nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended with Castro still alive, more defiant than ever, and with Operation Mongoose exposed as a dangerous gamble that nearly collided with global catastrophe. Yet, even after the missiles were withdrawn, Washington's obsession with Castro did not end. In fact, the failure only deepened the determination to remove him, ensuring that the covert war would continue into the next decade. The autumn air of 1962 carried with it a strange mixture of relief and unease. The world had stepped back from the brink of nuclear war, but in Washington, the mood was not triumph. It was exhaustion, laced with disillusionment. John F. Kennedy had stared down Nikita Khrushchev and, at least outwardly, emerged with a victory. The Soviet missiles were leaving Cuba. The U.S. had pledged not to invade the island. Humanity had survived. Yet, beneath the official narrative, one program sat like a shadow in the president's mind: Operation Mongoose. Kennedy had approved it in desperation after the Bay of Pigs. He had tolerated its more reckless edges, even its surreal assassination fantasies. But the missile crisis had changed everything. He now understood the dangerous paradox at its heart. On the one hand, Operation Mongoose promised the elimination of Castro, the source of the administration's greatest embarrassment. On the other hand, it risked pushing Cuba, and by extension the Soviet Union, into catastrophic retaliation. As the weeks after October passed, Kennedy began to distance himself from the CIA's covert war. Edward Lansdale, the charismatic architect of Mongoose, felt the chill. His memos became more desperate, urging continued sabotage, new waves of psychological warfare, fresh attempts at internal rebellion. But at the White House, attention was shifting. Kennedy had learned firsthand how little control he actually held over covert operations once the CIA machine was set in motion. Even in the middle of the missile crisis, plots had moved forward without his full knowledge. He was furious. To Robert Kennedy, the president confided that the agency seemed to be running its own war, unbound by the restraints of diplomacy or even nuclear reality. By early 1963, Operation Mongoose was quietly winding down. No formal announcement, no order to dismantle it, just a suffocation of support, a drying up of momentum. Sabotage raids against Cuba continued sporadically, often under the guise of exile groups, but the grandiose dream of decapitating Castro through outlandish plots was losing steam. Kennedy, already thinking about re-election, began to reconsider his Cuba policy. Some historians argue that he was preparing to shift toward a cautious accommodation with Castro, seeking a stable coexistence rather than endless confrontation. Whether that would have materialized, history never allowed us to know. Then came Dallas. November 22, 1963. Shots echoed through Dealey Plaza, and John F. Kennedy was gone. In the aftermath, a wave of paranoia swept across America and Cuba. Castro himself, when told of the assassination, reportedly asked in shock, "Did they do it? Was it us?" For years, speculation swirled that Operation Mongoose, or Castro's revenge against it, might have played some role in Kennedy's death. No conclusive evidence ever proved such a link, but the timing and secrecy ensured the question would never disappear. For the CIA, Mongoose did not end with Kennedy's death. Elements of it lingered, reshaped, renamed, folded into other covert programs against Cuba. Sabotage missions continued under President Lyndon B. Johnson. Attempts on Castro's life multiplied. By some counts, more than 600 over the decades, yet none succeeded. Castro would go on to outlast 10 U.S. presidents, a living reminder of Washington's frustration. It would take more than a decade before the public learned the full extent of Operation Mongoose. In the mid-1970s, after the Watergate scandal, Congress turned its eyes toward the darker corners of the intelligence community. The Church Committee, named after Senator Frank Church, was tasked with investigating abuses of power by the CIA, FBI, and NSA. What they uncovered shocked the American public. Declassified testimony revealed the absurdity and recklessness of Mongoose in vivid detail. Poisoned cigars designed to kill Castro during one of his famous smoking sessions. A diving suit dusted with fungus spores meant to infect him with a fatal disease. A ballpoint pen rigged with a hypodermic needle filled with blackleaf 40, a deadly chemical. There were even discussions of using hallucinogens to disorient him during speeches, hoping he would lose credibility in front of the Cuban people. Each revelation blurred the line between farce and atrocity. What once sounded like satire was suddenly confirmed as historical fact. The American people were stunned. For years, such stories had been dismissed as Cold War rumors or Cuban propaganda. Now, under oath, CIA officials admitted their reality. Senators expressed disbelief. "This is not James Bond," one remarked. "This is the United States government." For many, it was the first time they realized how far the CIA had been willing to go in the name of national security, and how little oversight the president or Congress had exercised. The Church Committee's findings did not simply amuse, they disturbed, because behind the bizarre methods lay a sobering truth. Operation Mongoose had risked global war. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, assassination plots had run parallel to nuclear brinkmanship, almost ensuring a deadly collision. The revelation that the CIA had considered killing a foreign leader with the tacit approval of the highest offices in Washington sparked debates about morality, legality, and accountability that still resonate today. For Fidel Castro, the exposure was vindication. He had long claimed that the United States was trying to kill him. Now, the documents and testimonies confirmed it. In Havana, he mocked the CIA's failures, joking that if surviving assassination attempts were an Olympic sport, he would hold the gold medal. But beneath the humor lay genuine rage. To Castro, Mongoose was proof that the United States would never accept Cuban independence, only submission. The legacy hardened his resolve and deepened Cuba's alliance with Moscow. For Americans, the revelations also fueled a darker line of speculation. If the CIA could dream up exploding seashells and poisoned cigars, what else might it have done in secret? Did the agency's obsession with Castro bleed into other areas? Did the culture of assassination contribute to plots elsewhere in the world, against Lumumba in the Congo, against Diem in Vietnam, against Allende in Chile? The Church Committee could not answer every question, but it showed that assassination was not the fringe of CIA activity. It was a tool, one considered and deployed at the very highest levels of policy. By the late 1970s, Operation Mongoose had become a symbol of Cold War excess. Its name, once buried in secrecy, was now shorthand for the reckless ambition of American covert action. Hollywood parodied it, historians dissected it, journalists exposed new layers of detail. And yet, the deeper analysts looked, the more chilling the picture became. Because even though Castro had survived, the risks Mongoose created were very real. Had any of its plots succeeded in October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis might have ended not with withdrawal, but with mushroom clouds. The exposure of Mongoose forced reforms. Presidents after Gerald Ford issued executive orders banning assassination as an instrument of U.S. foreign policy. The CIA, bruised by scandal, became more cautious about overt lethal operations, at least officially. But the stain of Mongoose lingered. It was proof that in the Cold War, even the world's most powerful democracy could be seduced by the idea of eliminating its enemies in the shadows, no matter the cost. Looking back today, Operation Mongoose occupies a strange space in history. On one level, it reads like a tragic comedy, a greatest hits of botched spycraft, a gallery of absurd gadgets that failed to kill their target. But on another level, it stands as one of the most dangerous covert programs ever launched by the United States, one that nearly collided with nuclear war. The absurdity masked the peril. The jokes concealed the recklessness. And in the end, the man they could not kill, Fidel Castro, became the longest ruling leader in the Western Hemisphere. Each failed attempt only strengthened his legend, as if survival itself had become a form of resistance. Operation Mongoose, once a secret war meant to end him, instead became part of his myth. In the twilight of the Cold War's most dangerous years, Operation Mongoose remained both a buried memory and a haunting precedent. It had not achieved its objective. Fidel Castro was still alive. Cuba had not collapsed. And yet, the program left behind something far more enduring than its failures. It reshaped the way America thought about intelligence, covert war, and the ethics of assassination. For the men inside the CIA who had lived through it, Operation Mongoose was a bitter lesson in the limits of secret power. They had been given nearly unlimited resources, political backing at the highest levels, and the freedom to experiment with methods that bordered on science fiction. Still, they had failed to eliminate one bearded revolutionary 90 miles off Florida's coast. To them, the question lingered. If such vast effort could not succeed against Cuba, what did it mean for America's wider covert war against communism? Some took the lesson that future operations needed to be leaner, more disciplined, less fantastical. Others drew the opposite conclusion, that only greater ruthlessness would suffice. Within the agency's corridors, the ghost of Mongoose whispered in both directions. At the policy level, however, the exposure of Mongoose in the 1970s forced a reckoning. The Church Committee hearings revealed not just one reckless program, but a culture of impunity in which assassination had become a legitimate tool of statecraft. The revelations landed at a fragile moment. America was still reeling from Vietnam, scarred by Watergate, and wary of unchecked executive power. To many, the idea that their government had plotted to kill foreign leaders was a betrayal of democratic ideals. President Gerald Ford, attempting to restore trust, issued an executive order in 1976 explicitly banning political assassination by U.S. agencies. It was the first formal prohibition of its kind, a direct response to the public horror at Mongoose and other CIA plots. Later presidents, Carter, Reagan, even Clinton, would reaffirm the ban. Officially, the United States would no longer sanction assassination. Yet reality was never so simple. The Mongoose playbook, with its blend of sabotage, psychological warfare, and targeted elimination, continued to cast a long shadow. In Central America during the 1980s, covert operations against leftist governments bore the same hallmarks of proxy warfare, sabotage, and attempts to destabilize regimes from within. In Afghanistan, as the CIA funneled money and weapons to the Mujahideen, the lessons of Cuba lingered: support insurgents, avoid direct confrontation, keep American fingerprints hidden. Assassination itself remained taboo, at least in name. But when Washington began using targeted strikes, decapitation operations, or neutralizations, the distinction often seemed semantic. In the War on Terror, drone strikes became the 21st century's version of the poisoned cigar. Instead of exploding seashells or infected wetsuits, the tools were satellite-guided missiles, flown remotely from thousands of miles away. And yet, the underlying logic was the same. Remove the enemy leader, cripple the movement, win the war in silence. Operation Mongoose had been a failure, but its philosophy lived on. For intelligence professionals, Mongoose became a cautionary tale studied in training and whispered about in retrospectives. Analysts pointed to its absurd methods as proof of what happens when covert action loses discipline and oversight. Yet, others saw in it a daring spirit, an audacity that defined an era when anything seemed possible. The truth, perhaps, lay between those poles. For Castro himself, the legacy was far more personal. Each failed attempt reinforced his legend. The Cuban people came to see him as a man protected by destiny, a leader who could not be killed by the world's most powerful nation. His survival became a propaganda weapon, one he wielded with relish. The fact that the CIA had plotted against him only confirmed his narrative, that Cuba's revolution was righteous, its enemies cowardly, its survival miraculous. The global stage, too, took note. Leaders around the world watched the exposure of Mongoose with fascination and fear. Some saw it as a warning that if they ever defied Washington too directly, they might find themselves in Castro's shoes, targeted not with diplomacy, but with a hidden war. Others saw it as a weakness, that the United States, despite its power, had been unable to eliminate a single island leader. In both cases, America's credibility suffered. Inside Washington, the question never fully went away. Was Mongoose an aberration, or was it a glimpse into the true face of power? The answer varied depending on who you asked. To defenders of the CIA, it was a regrettable excess born of desperation, a moment when fear of communism eclipsed good judgment. To critics, it was a revelation that beneath the rhetoric of democracy, the United States was willing to act as brutally as any authoritarian state. The most haunting legacy, however, was the way Mongoose blurred the line between farce and catastrophe. Its most famous plots, exploding cigars, toxic diving suits, sounded like parody. They invited laughter, even mockery. But behind them lay real explosives, real toxins, real agents tasked with carrying them out. The absurdity masked the danger. And in October 1962, as nuclear missiles pointed toward American cities, those absurd plots were still in motion. One unlucky success could have turned comedy into apocalypse. Modern intelligence scholars point to this tension as the defining lesson of Mongoose. Covert action, when unleashed without restraint, can spiral into recklessness. The pursuit of plausible deniability can breed ideas so strange they escape serious scrutiny until it is too late. And assassination, no matter how targeted, always carries the risk of escalation. What begins as a secret operation against one man can end in a war that consumes millions. Decades after the files were unsealed, the echoes of Mongoose still reverberate in debates over targeted killing. When the United States approved drone strikes against terrorist leaders in Pakistan, Yemen, or Somalia, critics asked whether these were simply Mongoose by another name. When intelligence agencies considered cyber weapons designed to disable infrastructure or poison supply chains, the specter of Cuba's sabotage campaigns loomed. The tools had changed, but the dilemma remained. How far could a democracy go in secret, and what price would it pay if those secrets came to light? Perhaps the most sobering lesson is that assassination rarely achieves its intended outcome. Castro survived every attempt, and each failure only strengthened his hold on power. In the same way, modern decapitation strikes often create martyrs, inflame movements, and breed successors even more dangerous than the original target. Operation Mongoose promised a quick solution to a complex political problem. Instead, it prolonged the conflict, hardened resentments, and left scars that lasted generations. As the Cold War wound down, historians reassessed Mongoose not as a quirky footnote, but as a central episode in America's covert history. It was the moment when the United States crossed a moral Rubicon, embracing assassination as a legitimate option at the very top of government. It was also the moment when the limits of such action were exposed, not by Congress or courts, but by failure itself. And so, Operation Mongoose stands today as both a warning and a mirror. A warning of how quickly fear can justify extremes. A mirror reflecting the uncomfortable truth that even democracies, when cornered, can adopt the methods of their adversaries. As we look back on that secret war, one question lingers like smoke from a cigar never lit. If the fate of nations could once hang on an exploding seashell or a poisoned pen, what risks still lie hidden in the shadows of modern intelligence? Operation Mongoose was meant to be a silent war, a shadow campaign never meant for history books. And yet, when the files were opened, what spilled out was not triumph, but a cautionary tale, proof that even the most powerful nation can gamble with madness when fear takes hold. A poisoned cigar, an exploding seashell, a diving suit dusted with toxins. On the surface, they sound like jokes. But behind them lay the terrifying truth that assassination was once official policy, and the survival of millions balanced on reckless plans hidden from the world. Castro endured, long after his enemies were gone. The program designed to erase him instead cemented his legend, And in its wake, America was left to wrestle with a question that has never fully disappeared. If we were willing to do this in secret once, what lines might still be crossed in the name of security? The shadows of Operation Mongoose remind us that history's most dangerous battles are not always fought in the open. Sometimes they unfold in silence, behind locked doors, where decisions are made that could alter the fate of the world. And those shadows are not gone. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the hidden corridors of history. This is Chronicles of Sleep. If you found this story compelling, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves uncovering what history tried to hide. And tell us in the comments, if you discovered one government secret that had been hidden for decades, what would you most want it to reveal? Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and never forget what lies in the shadows.